Okay, folks, we are going to return to our presentation. So I'm going to introduce this next one. Isabel, whenever you are ready, you may get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel and throughout this school year, I have been exploring how learning an instrument in childhood can have later impacts on self-discipline levels of high school students. There are countless sources that say children that learn instruments develop things such as fine motor skills more than those without this experience. Can you imagine how childhood education could change to accommodate this if the data was proven to be more than true for just fine motor skills? Throughout this school year, I have worked to develop the research question that states, from the perspective of high school students, to what extent does learning an instrument between the ages of 5 to 12 impact self-discipline levels? Before we continue, I would like to walk you through the process of gathering my research question. My initial interest in the topic of later implications of learning an instrument in childhood came from a running joke I would hear amongst my sister's friends. I have two sisters, and we would all play instruments, specifically piano, as children, and we were all similar when it comes to our academics and tend to do well in school. The joke was that we were all trained to do well in school as kids, and I thought that this was very funny, but something that I could look into more. After some initial research, I found that many scholars did agree with the joke that my sister's friends had been saying, in that learning an instrument in childhood can have long-lasting effects later in school. Moving forward, I would like to define certain elements of my research question. First, childhood is defined as a state of being a child by the Oxford Dictionary. For the purposes of this study, I refer to childhood as the ages between 5 and 12. Next, self-discipline is defined as the ability to control one's feelings and overcome one's weaknesses. Finally, learning an instrument can be defined as using an object or your voice to make music for a set period of time by the Oxford Dictionary. As this definition is more subjective, so for the purposes of this presentation, the average time playing an instrument was lessons once a week for 30 minutes a week. Moving on to the next topic, we will look at an abridged literature review that allows us to have a basic understanding of how the topic of learning an instrument in childhood has been previously studied. Moving to the first and one of the larger topic studies is how cognitive functioning is influenced by learning an instrument. An older study from 2009 by Susan Hallam examined the cognitive functioning of children aged 4 to 6 before and after undergoing 7 consecutive weeks of learning an instrument for 25-minute lessons a week. Over this time, it was found that there was increased cognitive functioning in these children after learning an instrument. In agreement, a study from 2022 from John Rick and Josha expressed a correlation between learning an instrument for long-term and cognitive functioning increasing in middle school students. In contrast, Sala and Gobet, from a 2020 research study, found that there was no direct correlation between learning instrument and cognitive function. So we see that there is a gap in some of this research. The next topic that was popularly studied is how early learning programs specifically influence the outcomes of learning an instrument. A recent study from Ho et al. 2020 observed children around the age of 5 learning an instrument, and over time, parents of these children reported positive impacts on the children's behavior. This could be them tending to be in a better, more positive mood or smiling more often. Next, Kleinden's 1991 found that after 5th grade students learned an instrument, there were positive changes in general, but not specifically for self-discipline levels. For general knowledge on early learning, Rauscher and Grun, 2007, state that as early as preschool, vocal performances use expressive movements, emotion, and cognitive functions for exploration that have importance when it comes to implications of learning an instrument in childhood. This topic has a more cohesive conclusion that learning in childhood has high importance. The final topic that stood out in the existing literature was motivation in learning an instrument. Young et al. 2013 found that access to an instrument at home had an impact on the outcomes of learning an instrument. Specifically, after observing students that had access to an instrument at home compared to those that did not, it was found to be a positive predictor in academic achievement. Next, specifically looking at self-discipline, Meyer and Bugos 2017 observed how encouraging a self-regulated learning strategy in students increased their self-discipline levels. In all, these researchers agree with the importance of availability and motivation in learning an instrument. As I was studying pre-existing literature, there are many similarities that gave me guidance when creating my own research questions, such as the use of qualitative methods to hear from the perspectives of experiences. However, some similarities, such as only looking at the parents, teachers, or scholars as respondents, left the first-hand perspective of those undergoing an instrument understudied. As well, focusing on an outcome such as self-discipline was rarely specified in specific scholarly work. To address the gap in literature that is the experience of high school students that have undergone learning an instrument, I conducted a qualitative phenomenological study using a Google form and an online survey. When it comes to the significance of this study, it is important to address the gap in scholarly research. By hearing the first-hand experiences of high school students and how learning an instrument has or hasn't impacted their self-discipline levels, we closed the gap that was not being addressed and gained further implications that will be explained later in this presentation. The research question that has been developed to address the gap in literature is, from the perspective of high school students, to To what extent does learning an instrument between the ages of 5 to 12 impact self-discipline levels? This research question addresses the gap of not hearing from the people who actually experience playing an instrument and also explores an implication that has not been greatly studied, self-discipline. When it comes to the method of my study, I used a qualitative method with phenomenological design and the use of Google form as an instrument. There are many steps that led me to choosing the final conclusion, and now I will walk you through the process of choosing a method. One of the first decisions when it came to choosing a method was the decision to use a qualitative method. I was quickly introduced to qualitative methods in my literature review, as a majority of the studies conducted used human participants and used a qualitative method to hear from their first-hand experiences. I found that with my research aim of hearing from first-hand experiences, a qualitative method would be best to guide my research and create a space that the participants were open to share their own experience in their own word using open-ended questions. This decision then led to understanding my research design. There are many different designs that can be used in the qualitative study. However, a phenomenological design was best suited for my research and understanding the essence of learning an instrument through high school student perspectives. Michael Worthington shares that when it comes to a phenomenological study, readers should feel as though they have experienced the phenomenon being studied. This was the research goal in my research. Using this design, I was able to understand the experience that high school students have had as a result of learning an instrument in childhood. When it came to deciding how participants would be able to participate in my research and share their own lived experiences, there were many options again, such as interviews and more. Overall, I decided that using an online Google form was the best way for participants to be involved in the study. There are many reasons why Google form is best suited for my research, the first being organizational purposes. For both the participant and myself, using the Google form kept all of the questions organized visually and the instructions very clear of where to respond. Next, the timing of the participants responding would not be limited. I had discussed using an interview style, but then I realized scheduling purposes for both the respondents and myself could be a conflict. Overall, the use of Google form would be familiar for many students participating and be convenient in many ways. Those are some examples of questions that were on the Google form. The next portion of my research method was understanding the ethics involved specifically in human research. My respondents were all high school students, which meant that they would be under or around the age of 18. Ethical considerations were taken fairly highly in my presentation, and every step was taken to minimize any potential for harm. As a result of participation in the study, the first step when forming my survey was that participants, after reading a short summary of the study and what the requirements were to participate, were given a consent form which they had to agree with in order to participate. All of my participants gave consent to being a part of the study. With this, participants were all explained that they had the option to withdraw their consent at any point in the study, and that all of their personal information, including any stories that could be connected to them, were kept confidential. Through these steps taken to minimize any potential harm, this research was approved by the Institutional Review Board before being opened to the public. When publishing my survey to be answered by participants, I decided to use a QR code attached to a poster for easy access to high school students. This decision aligned with the convenience sampling method, which meant that the individuals participating would have to choose on their own to participate, and that everyone within my school would have equal opportunity. This poster was posted around my school in many areas, but after a short period of time, there were not many respondents. This is when I then decided to take action and reached out to a few teachers, specifically the music teacher and the AP seminar and research teacher, to then post this within their classrooms, and that's when I gathered the needed amount of participants. This time of data collection was around 3 weeks. The final aspect of my methodology that I would like to mention is the coding process. I had a total of 17 responses that were all under the inclusion criteria of high school students that signed the consent form. When it came to coding my responses, I used an inductive approach, which meant that themes would emerge not from a previous hypothesis or research. Specifically, I used a line-by-line coding method and did a total of 3 coding rounds. I used the specific responses when moving into the results section, which allowed me to connect back to that phenomenological design choice. Moving on to my results, there were many important findings that came up, but there are 5 that I would like to highlight today. The first is that overall, individuals that participated in the study expressed that learning an instrument in childhood has had a positive impact on their self-discipline levels. Next, participants who stated they enjoyed playing their instrument of their choice found that this increased their level of practice and their level of self-discipline as a result. It is important to note that out of all the participants, many had a similar childhood experience when it came to exposure to music, either through parents, siblings, radio, or even school. With these similarities, not all individuals responded the same. Some found interest in learning an instrument through hearing others do that in childhood, whereas others did not express any interest in learning an instrument even when those nearby them were. Moving on to the next finding. Even though the focus of the study was on self-discipline as a result of learning an instrument in childhood, many respondents brought up another important factor, which was time management and sense of urgency awareness. Respondents shared that through playing an instrument, they felt they understood deadlines better and were able to schedule their time so that they could attend to everything more frequently. Finally, it was found that those that had been playing for an instrument for a longer time, has had a greater impact on those factors such as self-discipline and time management skills. These last two findings are very important as we lead into future implications. Based on these findings, I was able to conclude an answer to the research question which asks, from the perspective of high school students, to what extent does learning an instrument in childhood, or learning an instrument from the ages of 5 to 12 impact self-discipline levels? To answer my research question, it was found that learning an instrument in childhood has a positive impact on self-discipline levels of high school students. The aim of this research was to fill a gap in the literature surrounding the idea of learning an instrument in childhood through the perspective of high school students. This research was successfully able to address the first-hand perspectives that were not previously studied, and important findings were found as a result. Previous research had a variety of supporters for the theory that learning an instrument in childhood has an impact on future factors, such as Lam, 2019, Jean-Arc-Conjoja, 2022, and Ho et al. The data that was collected through this study of first-hand experiences of high school students that learned an instrument in childhood agrees with these researchers that learning an instrument has a positive impact on self-discipline. In all, the gap of both first-hand experience and self-discipline were addressed in this study. While there are important findings as a result of this study, it is essential to take into account that there are limitations present as well for a well-rounded understanding. First, this study lacks generalizability, as it was not a large sample ranging from different areas. Specifically, I was able to gather participants through a convenient sampling, which meant they had to decide to participate in the study. So some individual responses would not be present in my results. As well, only 17 participants were gathered, so the results in all are not able to be applied to high school students as a whole. Next, as with all qualitative research, the limitation of subjectivity is important to address. Since I, as the researcher, have my own experience and my own bias, this may show through my paper and my results as a whole. For example, if another researcher were to code the same responses, there's a possibility other important findings and conclusions could be made. Finally, with this study, the time of data collection was around 3 weeks, which meant limited time for respondents to see that participating in the study was an option. Since my study used a Google form, there were not many resources needed, but there were not many funds available for the study, which also contributed to that decision to use a Google form. In all, there are many limitations with this study that should be taken into consideration. As mentioned earlier, we will now go into the implications portion of this presentation. An inductive approach was taken when coding, which then allows for new findings to emerge that were not previously expected. First, this research from the first-hand perspective of high school students has its limitation as the sample size was small, and the area of study did not have a wide range of students. This research supports the idea that further research should be conducted in the first-hand perspective of high school students. Next, this study that was limited in the number of factors it examined. This study did not look into how factors such as time management, stress, or mental health were impacted by learning an instrument in childhood. Many respondents brought up topics that fit into these categories, and because of that, this research encourages research that looks into other important factors that can be impacted by learning an instrument in childhood. Finally, with the results of the study, many respondents found that learning an instrument had a positive impact on their self-discipline levels in high school. With this in mind, there are many responses that expressed limits when it came to accessing learning an instrument. Another way that the study can impact the future of individuals is by looking into how some individuals may be limited from learning an instrument for barriers such as availability, cost, and more. As I near the end of my presentation, after hearing from the perspective of high school students, I would like to express that my conclusions, while limited, provide insights and direction for future research on the impacts of learning an instrument in childhood. Thank you for your time and attention, and here are my references.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Moving into your oral defense, for your first question, we'd like to ask.
Hi. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
Thank you for that question. So the choices that I made in the beginning really did impact my research process, such as the deciding to use qualitative research at the start. That then led me to looking into further research and how my literature that I had studied, really what designs they used, and that impacted my choice, which then led me to a phenomenological design choice. Furthermore, then looking at the instruments that they use, just really looking, seeing how other researchers have done their things and what their outcomes were. This impacted how I decided to use a Google form as an instrument, and then seeing how I could apply that to these high school students.
Hi, Isabel. My question is, how do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
That's a really good question. So as I've expressed in this research, there are many limitations, such as my small sample size. So really all the research that I've done in this just is an intro to how high school student perspectives are important when it comes to learning an instrument in childhood and seeing how that has broader implications, really. So my directions for future research would be just further research on high school students, as well as looking into self-discipline and those other factors that students brought up on their own, such as time management and even mental health was brought up. So really just future research needs to be done with high school students, as well as all the other factors that can be considered.
Last question, Isabel. What has been the most important research skill that you've developed as a result of the process, and how might you apply it to any future endeavors?
Thank you for that question. So throughout this research process, there were many things that I learned, such as analyzing literature properly, deciding how to conduct my own research, and actually implementing that. So I would say one of the most important things that I learned is how to really analyze literature and understand the method that they use, which then can impact how I decided to conduct my own research. So in future endeavors, when I decide to conduct more research, I know now that I can look into literature and take inspiration from that, as well as use that to guide my own way and creating new instruments, new ways of conducting research. But really, that was one of the most important skills that I learned.
Excellent, thank you. Isabel, congratulations. You are officially done your AP research presentation. Everyone, round of applause.